Morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Capitalist Cast. Joining me today is Lowman Henry of the Lincoln Institute. Lowman, would you mind just giving people a quick rundown of what the Lincoln Institute does? And I mean, you're a man of many hats, so as many of those hats as you want to talk about.
Well, the Lincoln Institute specifically, Leo, we're a nonprofit educational foundation. We're based here near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we do a number of things. Most notably, we produce syndicated radio programming. We have Lincoln Radio Journal, which is our state issues radio show. We are on about 90 stations throughout the state. We also have American Radio Journal, which is a national issues radio program, and we are on 254 stations around the country. We publish patownhall.com, which is an aggregator website where we have the work of 20-some different conservative organizations and authors that we publish daily on that website. And as the name might suggest, we also do public opinion research, particularly our Keystone Business Climate Survey of our state's employers and business owners, which we do twice a year, and which we're working on right now. We'll have a new one out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I know that the surveys that you put out, as well as the Lincoln Radio Journal, in particular, are products that I appreciate. And I mean, I've been listening to the Lincoln Radio Journal for probably 15 years since I first started getting interested in state politics. I wanted you to come on today. You published a really good piece on the PA Town Hall about some of Tom Wolf's recommendations, or some of the stuff that's happening as it relates to transportation funding and taxes and everything. And that's actually something that I'll be sending out as well as a guest post to CAPS subscribers. But Pennsylvania, I'm sure most of our audience already recognizes that Pennsylvania has the highest gas tax in the country.
We do.
As much as we would like to blame that on, or as much as people would like to blame that on Tom Wolf, that kind of that particular problem wasn't his. That was something that he had inherited from the Corbett administration. But the problem with Pennsylvania's transportation funding, as you mentioned in your piece, goes beyond just the gas taxes. So I really wanted you to talk about that as someone who's observed what's happened in Pennsylvania for a while, just to give some additional background, and we can talk about what Governor Wolf is now suggesting and just go from there.
Well, the whole labyrinth that is transportation funding in Pennsylvania, it's something that, Leo, nobody's ever taken a comprehensive approach to funding transportation. And by transportation, I mean our state's roads and bridges, which is what we're all most familiar with. A huge part of the issue or the problem is public transportation, particularly SEPTA in the Philadelphia area and at the Port Authority Transit in the Pittsburgh area, are huge drains on statewide transportation funds. So you add all that together, not to mention airports and railroads, which are part of the equation, and it's just a patchwork quilt of how we fund all these things. For example, one of the biggest problems right now centers on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And anybody who's driven on the Pennsylvania Turnpike in the last few years has noticed that we've had these annual increases in tolls. And they're not small, they're big increases every year. This has been going on now for 7 or 8 years. It's projected to continue escalating over the next at least 5 or 6 years. And all of this is because back during the Rendell administration, what occurred was the governor, Ed Rendell at the time, wanted to toll Interstate 80. And Interstate 80, of course, runs east-west across sort of the central northern tier of Pennsylvania. The governor, Rendell, wanted to toll Interstate 80. And in exchange for that, he wanted the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission to provide funding, and it's somewhere north of $200 million a year that would go turnpike coffers in PennDOT. It's important to understand that the Turnpike and PennDOT are two completely separate organizations. PennDOT is a cabinet agency under the governor. The Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission is a quasi-independent commission. So this law passed, and the Turnpike has been sending hundreds of millions, now over $1 billion of turnpike toll revenue to PennDOT, a large part of which is going into the public transportation agencies I mentioned earlier. In the meantime, the effort to toll Interstate 80 failed because federal law did not allow it to occur. And Rendell tried to get that changed during the administration of George W. Bush. And then when Barack Obama came into office, he thought he could get the Democrats to allow it to happen. They also didn't allow it to happen. So what we've been stuck with is no tolling on Interstate 80, which, by the way, was a horrible idea to begin with. No revenue coming into the turnpike from tolling, but money going out to PennDOT because the law requires it. So what this has done is caused the Turnpike Commission to have to keep raising tolls year after year in order to send this money to PennDOT. So that has not only cost turnpike travelers more money, but it's taken needed dollars away from maintenance on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which, by the way, was the first superhighway ever built in the world. And some of the tunnels, particularly the Allegheny Tunnel near Somerset, are old and in need of replacement. But this revenue drain is preventing that from happening. So you have that dynamic at play. In the meantime, as you mentioned, under Governor Tom Corbett, and this was particularly distressing that this occurred during a Republican administration, Leo, because theoretically, Republicans are supposed to be for lower taxes and lower spending. But under Tom Corbett, that didn't happen, right? Under Tom Corbett, what occurred was an increase in taxes on oil refineries, which of course they passed along to we the consumer, and it ended up essentially increasing the cost of a gallon of gasoline by 30 cents a gallon over a 3-year period, ending up in what you mentioned, which is we pay the highest gas tax in the nation. So all of this occurred before Tom Wolf came into office. So we have a history under governors, both Republican and Democrat, of taking policy steps that absolutely are expensive to consumers and simply don't address the problem.
Yeah, and compounding the issue as well, when we look at how things are funded, the Pennsylvania State Police, their funding comes out of the transportation budget. If I'm not mistaken, and one of the comments on here, one of our commenters mentioned it, an Auditor General report actually found that money was going from a restricted account that shouldn't have funded the state police into the state police in order to fund them. Yeah. The governor has suggested, on numerous occasions that for these municipalities that don't have their own police presences, that are reliant on the state police, to start charging them a fee in order to cover it.
It's worse than that. The governor's proposal to start charging municipalities that don't have state police for state police coverage. He also wants to charge municipalities that have police forces for state police coverage, which another hat that I wear, I'm a township supervisor. And we have a very large township here in Lower Paxton. We spend something like $11 million a year on our police force. If this proposal by the governor passes, we would have to spend an additional $500,000 or so and send to the state to help pay for state police coverage, which we don't need because we already have our own. So this is another way that rather than place the taxation where it needs to be, they're taxing or proposing to tax segments of the consumer base in order to subsidize other segments, which is the problem with the whole thing.
Yeah, and I mean, a principle, kind of a gold standard that we look to is, are you paying for the services you need, or are you paying for the services that you're using, I guess would be a better way to put it. So, when folks talk about, toll bridges and tolling and things like that, in and of itself, a toll bridge isn't a bad thing if the money is only going, if the toll you're collecting is only going to support that bridge. Where, Pennsylvania has really run into problems, like you said, with the Turnpike Commission, is we have tolls that are being collected as someone drives on the turnpike. those tolls aren't just going to fund repairs to the turnpike. They're being siphoned off into PennDOT's budget, and then from PennDOT's budget into different mass transit systems.
Yep.
So
Yep.
these mass transit systems aren't self-sustaining. I mean, they've never been self-sustaining.
Nope.
The people who are using those systems aren't actually paying for the services that they're consuming. And beyond that, we have just some absolutely insane labor contracts and costs that go into the construction portion of, whether we're talking about public roads and bridges, or when we're talking about state roads versus the turnpike. There are a lot of problems with how those things are, and even as a local government official, you guys run into issues where citizens are forced to overpay for road construction and for most government funded projects.
And that's what's kicked off the whole discussion here. Is HUD is proposing to now place tolls on a number of key bridges all across the state. Now, of course, if you do that, obviously what you're going to do is consumers are now going to have to pay to use that bridge, and these are consumers, they're motorists who've already paid for the bridge because they're paying the gas tax, are now going to also have to pay a toll. It also increases dramatically the cost, especially for truck drivers, for trucking firms. And of course, every time the transportation cost goes up for a trucking firm, and by the way, because of Biden administration's policies, the cost of gasoline and diesel has gone through the roof. So we already have that increase taking place. This then gets passed along to all of us in terms of what we pay for goods that are shipped by truck. So this whole idea of tolling these bridges is what has kicked up the desire for the governor to form a special commission to look into, as he put it, reform and alternatives to the gas tax. Now, there are two ways of looking at this, Leo. For many of us, the idea of having a commission to look into reforming the gas tax is an opportunity for this commission, which is comprised of members of the administration, legislators, et cetera, some local government folks, to possibly come up with a comprehensive reform of the whole system. Unfortunately, what I think it's going to turn into is it's going to be political cover for the governor to propose some sort of a new tax on all of us. Probably, in all likelihood, a mile. In a number of states, instead of gasoline tax, or in addition to, which is even worse, gasoline tax, you pay every year based on how many miles you've driven your car or truck. So the question is, will this commission be cover for just another massive increase in funding, or will it be an actual attempt to try and restructure how we fund transportation and bring some sort of logic, at least, to how we do it? Which I know it's a lot asking for logic from government, but
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that it is it's a real look at what can we do, because you're right, there really is there's no rhyme or reason to how things are funded. As you mentioned in the column that you wrote, it's really set up. The legislature jumps from crisis to crisis. And rather than looking at the entirety of something, they look at it, well, this is the problem that I need to fix today, so this is the only problem I'm going to look at. It's interesting. There's an interesting parallel to how transportation is funded and kind of the patchwork of things that we've done. And this may seem like a bizarre comparison, but also like when you take a look at another great example, and I learned this when I was talking to Representative Seth Grove a couple of weeks ago. It's similar to like how the election code operates. The election code was written in 1937, right? So from 1937, according to Representative Grove, there's actually a provision in the law that polling places are still to be provided with lanterns. So, I mean,
well, you've got to be able to see, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have these laws that are passed. Pennsylvania is technically a full-time legislature, but the lawmakers never actually stop and take comprehensive looks at what they've done to try and figure out, is there something what do we need to change? Obviously
Yeah.
a lantern in a polling place is kind of a silly example, but it's a real example of things that have just stayed in statute because nobody has bothered to take a look at the whole piece. They're looking at
Well,
like one small problem and that's it.
And therein lies the problem, Leo. Our legislature looks at issues and problems in terms of a 2-year horizon, because members of the state
Exactly.
house are elected every 2 years, senators every 4, so they don't really look beyond 2 or 3 years either. So rather than say, okay, we need to take this whole set of problems, comprehensively reform it so that it makes sense and it actually works, and that's going to involve some really difficult political decisions. For example, to really reform transportation funding, you've got to deal with the absurd labor contracts in public transit. Well, the unions, of course, weigh in against that. And now what we have are a couple of looming crises. First of all, relative to the gas tax revenue is, as a percentage of the budget, on the decline, because, well, first of all, over the last year with COVID, there was a lot less travel. So
Right.
that took a ding out of the gas tax. Second, our vehicles have gotten more fuel efficient over the years. So you use less gas. And now there's this drive from the radical left to switch everything over immediately to electronic vehicles. Well, electric vehicles. In addition to the fact we don't produce enough electricity to fuel these vehicles, that would remove gas tax revenue. So all of this is happening, and the gas tax revenue is not keeping pace with need. Then, relative to the situation with the Turnpike, in a couple of years, that money that goes from the Turnpike to PennDOT is scheduled to end. That is going to put an immediate hole, a large hole, in PennDOT's budget. So somebody's going to come at us with either a big increase in gas taxes or the establishment of another tax. So we have problems on the horizon. And to the degree that there's a commission being formed to look at it, it's good that we're not waiting for the crisis to be upon us. The question is this going to be a reform commission, or is this going to be, how do we tax more commission?
Yeah. And it's interesting, you bring up just kind of my fear is that it does turn into another kind of nickel and diming situation as it relates to taxpayers. And part of the reason that I'm concerned about that is, while Governor Wolf is on the one hand talking about, well, we need to look at alternatives to the gas tax and we need to do, X, Y, and Z because of the tax burden that's being placed on people. On the other hand, he's also, by executive fiat, making Pennsylvania part of something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. So the Transportation Climate Initiative is kind of another Green New Deal-esque situation where the governor wants Pennsylvania to join with a consortium of northeastern states. And what will end up happening is it will add another gas tax onto what we already have in order to, fund the more environmentally friendly options, in order to siphon money from rural Pennsylvania, who are the ones who end up driving more, to your more urban and suburban centers so that their mass transit has more money. So it's really this, it has the appearance of, I'm going to put up this commission. Oh, hey, what do you know? They recommended me do the things that I was doing anyway. It's kind of like when Dick Cheney was running the Vice Presidential Search Commission and found that he was the best guy for the job.
That was an amazing outcome.
Yeah.
It's even worse than that, Leo. Not only is the governor pushing that relative to wanting to tax the users of automobiles more, because the radical left, the environmental left, seems to think that any amount of CO2 is bad. Of course, right. We will mention that plants and trees and everything live off of CO2, so you need a certain amount of it, or we'd have no vegetation. Pennsylvania, by the way, Leo, is actually under standards set by that, and also under the standards, and by under, I mean our CO2 emissions are lower than what the targets are for that proposed program. And then there's something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which would also tax carbon dioxide emissions from power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants. Now, not only will that devastate jobs, particularly in the western part of Pennsylvania, but it will add to our electric bills. So consumers would pay more for energy for electric bills, and manufacturers, which are are huge users of energy, would pay more. So the cost of goods that we buy would go up. So these two programs combined would be a giant hit to the wallets of anybody who lives in the Commonwealth.
Oh,
Too
no,
little
absolutely.
effect.
Yeah, and that's really the issue. It is to very little effect, because when you take a look at it, I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly or not, but I think over the past 20 years, Pennsylvania's CO2 emissions have gone down something like 30%, or I mean,
Yes.
it's a very substantial number, and it's going down not because of new government mandates and climate control policies and everything like that. It's going down because you're actually seeing some of these older coal-fired power plants either are, they're reaching the end of their lifespan. But the other thing that you're really seeing is because of our low-cost energy production in terms of natural gas, you have a lot of suppliers switching over to natural gas on it because of the economics of it. And that has drastically reduced the amount of CO2 that's going into the environment. And that's something that's happening naturally as a result, again, a result of something that Governor Wolf, wants to stop, which is natural gas drilling. He wants to extract more money from that. So, I mean, we have these solutions that are occurring naturally, but then, the governor, no one looks at what's going on in a big picture. It's always this problem in isolation, this problem in isolation, this problem in isolation, and they're not looking at everything holistically.
Well, and even worse, Leo, they're looking at it ideologically. In other words, anything that produces carbon dioxide is bad. Not to mention the many benefits that we get from being able to walk out of our door and get in a car and drive somewhere, or to flip the light switch and get energy that is affordable to Pennsylvania families. I mean, all these things are important too. But this governor, in every aspect of his administration, from environment to taxation, and we won't even get into the handling of the coronavirus crisis, everything has been driven by left-wing ideology. And that's why I fear the outcome of this commission on the gasoline tax, because part of that left-wing ideology is the fact that the governor is a wholly owned subsidiary of labor unions, and you're not going to resolve the problem unless you get a grip on labor contracts. There's no way in the world Governor Wolf is ever going to do that. So we have to be really on guard that this just doesn't become another raid on our wallets.
Yeah, and not just in terms of the mass transit unions, but also when you take a look at one of the major cost drivers for local governments, as well as the state government, is something that's called prevailing wage.
Yeah.
Where if you as a township supervisor wanted to repave a road, you're basically required to pay the same rate as if you were doing this project in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And it's appalling, because what it does is it forces local governments and the state government to overpay for no reason at all. There's no difference in safety in states that have these prevailing wage laws versus states that don't have prevailing wage laws. Yeah. It's a kickback to unions, and it's something that's been happening. It's something that's been happening for decades. It actually, when you look at the genesis of the prevailing wage laws, much like the minimum wage laws, it actually goes back to the Jim Crow era, where they wanted to keep minorities from getting these jobs because nobody wanted to pay a minority whatever the minimum wage was or whatever the prevailing wage was.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously we've had a national focus on racism for the last year or so, and some good is going to come out of that, because there certainly is an amount of institutional racism. I don't think it's all pervasive. But if you want to talk about minimum wage, you're absolutely right. The minimum wage laws were born out of a racist desire to keep African Americans from taking the jobs from whites. And yet you have the left, which is woke, so to speak, on racism, pushing a higher minimum wage. Which, by the way, everybody from the Congressional Budget Office on down has indicated that if this minimum wage is ever increased to $15, It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of jobs that are going to be lost. Um, One of the things we do at the Lincoln Institute, as I mentioned earlier, is we survey employers. And several times in the last few years, we've asked them, if the minimum wage is increased, what are you going to do? And the answers are, we're going to reduce the hours of our current employees, or we're going to have fewer employees. And in some cases, in small businesses, the margin is so small, if it goes up to that, they're simply going to go out of business, which means those jobs go away. So there's a holistic
or they get
approach.
transferred to major corporate employers who can absorb the cost because they're doing a high enough volume of business to do it.
Which is why a lot of the major employers are for an increase in minimum wage. They want to push the small guy out of business, and this is who has gotten hurt by all of these policies. Leo, is the little guy. The big guys are doing okay. Through the COVID-19 pandemic, all the big box stores stayed open. It's the little guys that had to close. We need to really be out there fighting for the little guy, for the neighborhood small business. I think the good news here, Leo, is that we are now in a gubernatorial election cycle. And mercifully, Governor Tom Wolf is term limited. He cannot run for reelection. So we have an open seat for governor. There's going to be a lot of competition for the two-party nominations for that. So we do have before us an opportunity to have a statewide discussion on these issues. And hopefully this year, the candidates are going to avoid personal attacks on each other, which we saw 4 years ago, and instead really talk about, what do we need to do here to move Pennsylvania forward? How can we bring about a transportation policy that is going to be unified and is going to address all these issues? Because, we need our roads and bridges to be in good shape. We all agree on that. It's how we get there that there's considerable disagreement on.
Exactly. Is it let's just throw more money at it, or do we start to look at the fact that Pennsylvania's, the lifespan of Pennsylvania's roads and bridges is woefully less than our neighboring states.
Well, yes.
And our costs are much higher. With the exception of New Jersey, I think our costs are one of the highest, on the East Coast as far as what it costs for construction on a per mile basis. So that, poor lifespan and high cost kind of indicates that there's a problem, that there's an underlying issue that we really need to be addressing.
Well, there are a whole host of underlying issues. Of course, weather is a problem for us here. That's very bad on roads. The other issue is Pennsylvania. We all know we're called the Keystone State. Well, we literally are. We're a hub of east, west, and north-south travel for truck traffic, and that truck traffic takes a toll, pardon the pun, on our roadways, which causes them to have to be rebuilt periodically. So you add that with a bureaucracy, a state bureaucracy that is bloated, inept, and construction costs that are out of line with the national average. And as a result, our roads and bridges are not in the condition that they need to be in. And worse, we keep getting, it doesn't matter, it's sort of like public education. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at the problem, it's never enough. And we always need more revenue, more taxes. And once they get it, that's not enough. We need even more. There's no end to it.
Yeah, and I hope you're right. I hope the fact that we are going into a gubernatorial election, we will have the types of conversations that we need to see. And I think it's good for the public to see it on both, on the Republican side and the Democrat side, to really understand, this is how these people want to spend your money. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. As you mentioned earlier, when higher costs, when taxes, when regulation add expense to businesses, the businesses aren't the ones who actually pay that. At the end of the day, it's the consumer. It's it's you and I. It's the people watching this. It's an increase in the cost of their groceries. It's an increase in the cost of lumber to build new houses. All of this stuff gets passed on to the consumer ultimately. And unless we're really serious about fixing some of these issues, the little guy is going to be the one who picks up the bill, from now until forever.
I know everybody gets excited. We're getting a $1,400 stimulus check or a $2,000 total stimulus check. Well, that's nice, but in the end, with these policies causing the cost of goods and services to go up, you're going to get that $1,400 stimulus check, but you're going to pay more now for gasoline and for energy and for all the things that you need. So really, you're not further ahead at the end of the day. The real solution
Well,
is to
yeah.
change the structural problem.
Yeah, and beyond that, the fact that the government, essentially steals 25% of my salary, and to give me back $1,400 it doesn't quite cover the amount that's going in. So if
No,
they wanted to
not at
make it
all.
better, just stop taking money out of my paycheck. All right. Well, hey, Lowman, we're just about at a half hour. I appreciate the time you took coming on today. As I mentioned, I'm going to be posting early next week. I'll be posting your blog post on this, the governor's new adventure in transportation costs, to our website, and sending that out to folks who have subscribed to our email list. Thank you very much for coming on today. I appreciate the conversation, and I know that our audience does too.
Thank you, Leo. Pleasure.